Hello and welcome to the OHF's webinar series powered by Gatorade, where we are offering presentations for U16 AAA players, parents, and coaches. My name is Scott Stevens, and I'm the Manager of Programs and Events for the Ontario Hockey Federation. For everyone's reference and convenience, all of the presentation and slide decks are available on the OHF website under the headings Players and Program of Excellence. For our presentation today, I want to introduce Andrew Hopf, who is the lead strength and conditioning coach with the University of Waterloo Department of Athletics and Recreation. Andrew is also the development strength and conditioning coach of the St. Louis Blues of the National Hockey League. Andrew will be focusing on stress and adaptation. On behalf of the Ontario Hockey Federation, thank you, Andrew, for taking the time and welcome. I will turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Scott. And I'm looking forward again to having this conversation. And I think this is a really important one for not just players and parents, but also coaches and program managers as they start to think about how they're designing their more holistic approach to developing their athletes' abilities, capacities over the course of a season or multiple seasons. I'm actually pretty far removed from playing minor hockey now, kind of entering my 40th year here, but I'm not that far removed from being immensely involved with minor hockey organizations. Throughout my time working with teams and even playing myself, the words hard work, relentless, grind, sacrifice, these are all words that are unbelievably common and important in developing an athlete's behavioral skill set, an understanding of what commitment really means, what hard work means. But there's not a lot of communication on the other side of the equation, which is recovery. And that's really what we're going to talk about today is how do we balance the importance of proper stress with the importance of appropriate recovery. And to really understand that, we need to look at what are we really trying to accomplish over the course of a season in terms of development plans and increasing a player's ability to really do more work. Essentially, what we're trying to do is increase their capacity. We're trying to increase their capacity to do the sport at higher paces for longer periods of time, under more variable and more stressful conditions, and really in a way that they continue to enjoy their sport at higher and faster paces. In order to do that, we need to not just keep working and working and working. We need to have a thoughtful, progressive approach to how we are balancing the work that we're expecting our athletes to do on and off the ice with appropriate recovery times. If we do this strategically well, we will see an increase in capacity. We will see an increase in tissue tolerance, meaning our body's ability to handle higher amounts of work and mitigate the risk of overuse and overstrain injury. And then obviously, if we're able to do that, we're able to express our skill at higher paces of play and hopefully have more fun in the game that we love. So I commented on this really being a balancing act, and it really is. Through sport, tournaments, practice play, that is going to yield a certain amount of stress. For example, if we look at a situation when we come off a 3-3 weekend, or we have a tournament weekend where we're on the road, maybe we're not eating right, maybe we're not sleeping right, there is a considerable amount of stress that's accumulated in that time. The question is are we balancing out on the recovery side of the equation? And in my experience, there is a lack of communication and a lack of planning on that side of things to counteract the amount of planning and amount of work and amount of attention that goes into this stress side of the equation. So in the world of strength conditioning and in the world of physiology, we have this concept that's called the general adaptation syndrome. So essentially what this means is when we train, Scott, can you see my cursor here? Yes? Okay. That'll just help guide me through this. So essentially what this means is that we all start at some baseline. Okay, so some baseline level performance. When we elicit a training bout, so practice, in the gym training, or even gameplay, that's known as a stressor. Once we elicit that stressor, we will actually see a drop in performance, for some period of time after that stressor, dependent upon, the duration of that drop in performance will be dependent upon the extent or the magnitude of that stress, the duration of that stress, and the impact it had on our bodies. However, if over the course of that time we have an appropriate amount of time to recover, we are providing our bodies with the right environments for recovery, i.e. sleep and nutrition, we will return to baseline and actually have a heightened level of physical performance afterwards. And this is called supercompensation. The goal through appropriate planning of not just training or practice bouts, but appropriate recovery time, the goal would be over the course of time, this whole process to continue. However, if we just kind of look at things, we're just going to work and work and work and work, and we don't allow for this to recover, we may start to see concepts of overtraining over time. And this is actually something we do see quite often, especially with teams that are playing 2 to 4 games per week. So if we look at major junior hockey, where they're playing that often and they don't have the ability to recover and they're on the road and their nutrition might not be great and their sleep might not be great, we will start to see this kind of maybe not a linear, but a trend in a drop in their performance level. And that's obviously not ideal. So the whole goal of this conversation is to have some dialogue around what are some mechanisms we can do to optimize the type of stress that's going to be imposed on our body, and then B, what are some mechanisms that we can explore regarding how can we optimally adapt to that stress. So I want to propose something here called intended versus unintended stress. And our bodies really can't decipher what stress is. It's going to have a very similar response. So I'll look at things first from the intended level of stress. So the first thing I listed here is neural challenge. So how hard is that bout? So the easiest way to look at this is more in the gym. So if we're lifting something that is relatively heavy, that's going to require a certain amount of neural demand. So that's one aspect of it that we do want to have. We want to have bouts in our life that are challenging, that we have to adapt to. Without that stress, we won't adapt in a positive way, right? And we can actually regress. Another level of intense stress might be mechanical challenge. So a lot of people who might be listening to this call might be interested in starting to progressively have conversations of how can I strategically gain lean muscle mass? And in order to do that, we need to expose our body to an appropriate amount of mechanical stress, mechanical challenge, where we see some strategic tissue breakdown, followed by a period of rest and growth, and then re-expose our body to that stress again. We may want to stress our bodies from a metabolic or energetic perspective, meaning that we're going to say, hey, we're 3-4 days out from a game. We want to have some sort of high metabolic stress type practice that we're going to recover from and then be ready for the game down the road. Essentially, this comes down to we're loading the body in a proper way. And then the best way to kind of reference back to that proper loading is to look at unintended stress. So if we look at unintended stress, this is the type of thing where we look at improper loading. So we'll use the example of a back squat or something like that in the gym. The intended stress would be to lift it properly with really, really good mechanics. We're putting force to the ground. We're bracing our trunks properly. There's no mechanical breakdown in the movement. And we get all the intended stress we want. The unintended stress may come from if we have not tissue breakdown, but if we have mechanical breakdowns and tissues are actually loaded in a way that we don't intend it to be loaded. And we may cause tissue breakdown in joints and connective tissues that we don't necessarily want to see. And that may actually require more recovery time that's needed than if it were just coming from our intended stress. So that's kind of what I mean by proper loading versus improper loading. Is, are we doing movements in the intended way? And if we do, we're going to have the intended stress. If we don't, we may still have the intended stress, but we may also compound that with some unintended stress. Other unintended stress may come from external environments, so exogenous stress. Perhaps, high amounts of stress from school, high amounts of stress from social life. Perhaps we're not eating in a way that is overly clean, and there's a cost to processed foods. Perhaps we're not sleeping great. Maybe we're in an environment that is overly, there's particles in the air, for example, that we're breathing in that might not be overly great and is resulting in our body having to compensate for that. So looking at what are we doing, not just in the gym, not just on the ice, but what are the other variables in life that are adding to that accumulated stress? The third area might be just inefficiency. Are we just working too hard to get the result we want? So where I mean by that, maybe this is kind of in the realm of power skating, and I always use the analogy of a hamster wheel. You can be working and working and working, but going nowhere. So are you being as efficient as possible in terms of your strategies on the ice? Are you being as efficient as possible in terms of your decisions in the gym? And really, are you doing things that are going to actually yield an outcome that you want to see? So I always look at this, and I like this little schematic I made up. If we decide the decisions we make are designed to kind of yield this amount of stress here through intended stress, that's great. The recovery time that it's going to take will be less than if we compounded that intended stress with greater unintended stress, which may mean we're going to have more recovery time. So again, I talk about optimizing the intended stress. So again, meaning the mechanical, the neural, the metabolic strain that we do want to impose on our bodies, that can be a good thing. So how can we optimize that? Number one, it's going to be understanding the desired outcome. So if we are trying to get, let's say, stronger, we are trying to improve our maximal strength abilities. Well, if that was the desired outcome, but we were just doing sets of 20 to 25 repetitions, well, that's not going to specifically allow our bodies to adapt to that. If we are trying to work on getting faster, so meaning we're trying to improve our abilities to accelerate, but we were just doing 45 or 60-second exhaustive sprints on the ice, if you will, well, we're not going to be working at our maximum rate of acceleration. So that would not be in line with what the desired outcome is. So my first step to optimize our intended stress is be very, very clear on what we're trying to achieve. And if the practice or the drill or the exercise isn't in line with what the desired outcome is, then perhaps it's not being as efficient as we can. The second piece that I want to encourage everyone to think about is improving their skill. So are you actually getting better at the movement that you are doing. That can be in the gym world, that can be on the field. So if you're doing sprinting work, that can be obviously on the ice, and skating abilities, increasing your toolbox to be able to do things more efficiently on the ice. If we can become more skillful and we can put force into the ground in a more efficient way, that is going to optimize the intended stress bucket and start to minimize the unintended stress bucket. Again, we talked back about loading tissues that we want to be loaded and try not to load tissues that we don't want to be loaded. The third point is prepare properly. In the last webinar that we did, we talked on the importance of preparation, activation, potentiation. All of those things are going to prepare your body to do the task that's going to be asked of it. If we do not warm up properly, if we are not prepared to even practice, then the unintended stress that we talk on may be more prevalent if we don't expose ourselves to a good warm-up. All right, so prepare properly. It is going to make sure that our tissues are prepared to do what's asked of it in practice and gameplay. It's going to be more likely to be able to get into ranges that are going to be asked of it in sport. And ultimately, it's going to decrease that unintended stress. The fourth thing is have a coach. Obviously, in the world of hockey, we have coaches. But have a coach, not just in hockey, but in strength conditioning, power skating, someone that can provide you feedback on if what you are doing is in line with what the intended stress is meant to be. And again, it's all designed around if we have high levels of intended stress and low levels of unintended stress, then we can recover faster and come back to baseline and then re-expose ourselves to more intended stress. If we have intended stress plus a lot of unintended stress, then the recovery time is going to be longer. And again, our goal, reflecting back to that general adaptation syndrome, is to progressively and strategically continue to expose ourselves to environments of stress, adapt to that stress so that we reach a new level of performance and then continue that process. The longer we have to wait to reach baseline and supercompensate, the less frequently we can actually expose ourselves to stressors that may be beneficial to us. So optimizing the other side of the equation. We talked about, and I'm sure there's been some other conversations in these webinar series around nutrition and recovery, but I think it's worth bringing up here as it relates to this. We train hard, we play hard, we practice hard. We can balance out the other side of the equation. The two big areas that are going to be involved that we have control over today are going to be sleep and nutrition. And there's three main concepts to both of those that I want to look at. Habits, quantity of sleep and nutrition, and quality of sleep and nutrition. So again, sleep and nutrition can be talks in and of themselves, but I want to introduce these concepts here as it relates to balancing out stress and adaptation. Again, when we stress our bodies, we have to adapt. In order to adapt, we need to have periods of rest. We need to have internal environments where we have hormone replenishment, nutritional macronutrient replenishment to allow our bodies to grow and get back to that baseline and beyond that baseline. So we talk about sleep. In general, we're going to want our athletes sleeping between 8 to perhaps even 11 or 12 hours per night, depending upon what age we're dealing with. That's pretty common knowledge. What isn't common knowledge is what are we doing prior to sleep to optimize the quality of our sleep? So that's where the habits come into play. So what is our sleep habits looking like? What is our sleep hygiene looking like? And are we allowing our bodies to, yes, get to bed at a time that's going to allow us to accumulate sufficient quantity of sleep, but also put our bodies in an environment that's going to optimize the quality. So habits that we can improve with this, or we can not maybe not improve, but start to work on, is number one, getting to bed at the same time every night. Our bodies have what's called a circadian rhythm, where it essentially is like a working clock. And in that working clock, it goes through cycles of hormone release, and it likes to be consistent. So ideally, we want our bodies to get to bed at the same time every single night, as much as possible. The second part of that is being able to put your body in an environment that is going to optimize getting to a deep sleep state faster. So making sure your room is dark, making sure your room is relatively cold. In order to get to into a deep sleep state, our body temperature actually has to drop by 1 to 3 degrees. So we want our rooms to be relatively cool if possible. We want it to be dark. We want it to be quiet. We want to stay away from screens. All of these things done as part of a system of habits are going to allow for better sleep consistency and better sleep quantity. Getting into nutrition, habits are very much the same. We want to allow ourselves to have an environment that we can improve consistency, improve the ability to kind of consistently take in good quality food and good quantities of food. So we often talk on what is our habits before we actually eat. They're going to allow us to do things consistently. So what I mean by this is proper planning, proper preparation. So cutting food, cooking food, pre-packaging food, have things in place ready to go, so that when life does get crazy, you have a set of habits that are going to allow you to do things as consistently as possible. Third part here is, again, optimizing training load. This is where perhaps working with sport coaches is going to be an important piece. So if we have a very, very busy week of practices and training and stuff like that, can we start to manipulate how hard that practice is? How many stops and starts are happening in that practice? How much battling are we doing in practice? For athletes that are listening to this, you can look at, well, what are you doing at school? Are you going to school and playing in multiple intramural environments? Are you also playing school sports? All of these things start to accumulate load. So are you actually taking more of a 1,000-foot view, looking at your week, looking at multiple weeks in a row, and saying, am I actually building in strategic rest periods that are going to allow me to adapt and grow? And again, I am almost as old school as they come, where it's work, 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 keep working. But the importance of rest and recovery really comes into play when we make sure we're strategically trying to expand capacity. The other piece to this, optimizing recovery, is have a support team around you. Have a team of manual therapists, massage therapists. Have a team of osteopathic practitioners, naturopaths, dietitians, people that, if you have the ability to access these resources, I would strongly encourage us to do that, because it can really optimize the recovery and adaptation side of the equation. So as we kind of wrap this up, and then we can kind of go through a couple scenarios of questions. Here are some things that I want to challenge us all to think about. First is, what are we really trying to accomplish through the training and development process? Be very specific and intentional in your development plan. That's where having a strength coach or a performance consultant can really help you understand strategically at certain periods of the year what we're trying to do, how we're trying to optimize that. Have conversations with your coach on what you can do more efficiently and effectively on the ice. Be willing to hopefully coaches who are listening to this, maybe do a quick audit of your own training plan and start to understand the types of stress that your practices will impose on your athletes. Again, I'm not using stress as a bad word here. I'm actually using it as a necessary word. However, practices that are battle oriented, if you will, or have more starts and stops are going to be much more stressful on the body than that of a more of a flow skill type sort of practice. So can you start to manipulate the types of practices? And then if it is a really stressful practice, are we providing sufficient amount of recovery before we kind of expose them to another stressful event? And that really comes into the magnitude of stress. So if it is a really, really hard practice, or we're coming off a hard weekend that has sufficient travel or quite a bit of travel, are we kind of allowing for appropriate recovery time after that? Perhaps that first practice back isn't the hardest practice of the week. Perhaps it's more of a flow sort of practice, get touches in the gym. Perhaps it is more, I'll use the word recovery loosely, but it isn't a high neural demand, high plyometric sort of training session. It's more kind of focused on blood flow, skill acquisition, and then be more strategic. And then finally, develop a team. Develop a team of people around you that are looking out for your best interests on both sides of the equation. Again, exposing you to the sufficient amounts of stress at the right time, but then also advocating for the other side of the equation and making sure that we're recovering appropriately to that stress so that we can continue to really enjoy the game that we love the most. So with that, we'll have some questions, and we'll perhaps have a little bit of dialogue from there.
Yeah. So Andrew, one thing that I did want to ask, we did mention having events, 3 games in 3 days or tournament type events that the players will be going through. Can you give us some examples on the best way to firstly adapt in between the games, and then secondary adapt after the weekend?
Yes, that's a great question. And the reality is you're not going to be able to adapt in between games. That is not going to happen. There's just not sufficient time. In some cases, for a lot of our minor sport athletes, you might play a game in the morning, and then you might have 7 or 8 hours off, and then you play again. And then you might play again 12 hours later. Like the reality is you are not adapting in that short of a window. Like adaptation will take 48 to 72 hours. So, but tournament weekends are core memories. They're some of the greatest memories I have as a minor hockey player. So what can we do in those moments? What we need to think about is first off is nutrition and hydration, and those are kind of synonymous. Is number one, are we rehydrating our bodies throughout the days? Are we getting appropriate amounts of electrolytes into our bodies to be able to kind of stay hydrated and make sure our nervous system is operating at the right level? And I know Gatorade most likely presented on that, so I would probably reference back to the timing and quantities in which you would be refueling throughout the day. So that's number one. Number two is nourishment. So after the game, are you getting appropriate amounts of carbohydrates and protein into you as soon as possible? We want to replenish our what's called muscle glycogen stores as quickly as possible, our liver glycogen stores, to make sure that when we do get back to gameplay, we're able to have sufficient amounts of fuel to drive performance on the ice. The next thing I would talk about in those weekends is just proper preparation, and make sure that your warm-ups are very much dialed in as a first step. And then second step is after the game, are you finding ways to start to kind of reset your body as quickly as possible? So even doing little things like foot ice baths and hands ice baths, trying to kind of get your internal body temperature down as quickly as possible so that you can have a little bit of downtime and then kind of re-ramp up for the game. So the reality is within a tournament weekend, you're not adapting. It's almost as impossible. You can sleep as well as you can eat as well as you can, but that is really to make sure that we stay as optimal as possible for those bouts of games. And then after the weekend, that's when the opportunity to adapt comes into play. And you really need to be kind of focused on perhaps having a couple of, and again, when I say recovery days, I don't mean doing nothing. Like, that's not sitting and playing PlayStation for multiple hours in a day. On a day like today where it's absolutely beautiful outside, that can mean going out for a really nice long walk and getting sun exposure. That can mean eating exceptionally well, really getting your sleep habits back on track, because let's be honest, when you're on the road and you're with all of your friends and you're in a hotel, our sleep habits might not be the most optimal that they would have been normally. So start to focus back on your habits. So again, within periods like that, it is take care of your body to make sure it has the fuel and the micronutrient resources needed to sustain output, and then adaptation recovery will most really happen after the fact.
Okay, no, that's great. One other thing that I did want to ask, when it comes to coaches, and we understand that obviously ice time is at a premium, and coaches are always ingrained to work the hardest that you can for the 50 minutes that you're on the ice, so you don't waste any ice time. What can coaches do better to implement? You did mention more flow type drills, things like that, to get, I guess it's more of an education piece for the coaches, that they have to understand that sometimes you can't go 100% all the time at practices for 50 minutes for 3 to 4 straight days, that you do have to take some, not time off, but just some easier drills or what have you. So how can they work those sorts of frameworks into their practice plans?
So again, my sense is this could easily be an entire seminar in and of itself. But what I would first advocate coaches to think about is, again, taking more of a 1,000-foot view of what is their seasonal plan look like? What are their objectives of the group? Where are we getting to? Like, what's the end goal first and foremost? And then from there, we can start to work backwards, and understand that there's going to be practices that are meant to be demanding, and that is absolutely okay. But then around those times in gameplay, how are we, strategizing? So what I would do is start to kind of look at on a very simple level, a challenging practice doesn't have to be overly stressful, if you know what I mean. So for example, if we wanted to have a relatively challenging skate that athletes would perceive as it was a good skate, I felt challenged, that could easily be more flow drills. There's not a lot of stops and starts. Perhaps there's more recovery built in into the drills themselves, versus small area games. There's contact, a lot of stops and starts. That sort of drill is going to be a lot more challenging than that of just more kind of flow, get a pass, go take a shot, curl out, reset. As hockey players, they're still going to perceive that as challenging. It's still work, but it is a different magnitude of stress compared to that stop and start, max effort acceleration, battle, get to the net. You know what I mean? So what I would say to coaches is, number one, look at your entire week and understand, if you play on a Friday or Saturday game, that really challenging practice that is meant to be fatiguing and stressful, you probably want to happen earlier in the week, most likely a Tuesday. All right. So we have 48 to 72 hours to adapt to that. as we head into later in the week. That this does not mean that we can't work hard. Again, but we want to work hard in a way that practice isn't going to render us unavailable from a performance standpoint, because we're in that kind of resistance phase of that general adaptation syndrome during our gameplay. So it's more looking at your week, understanding where our practices lie in relation to gameplay, and can we strategically design our practices to be more cognizant of the general adaptation syndrome and where it lies in respect to our gameplay.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I think that's it for today, Andrew. I want to thank you again for taking the time, and just remind everybody to visit the OHF website for all the presentation recordings as well as the PowerPoint slide decks. If you do have any questions, my contact information is on the OHF website, so please feel free to contact me. And on behalf of the Ontario Hockey Federation, thank you for your time, and we'll chat with you soon.